Okay, so time for Good Week, Bad Week, a segment in which we usually try to talk about topics that are a little bit more under the radar. So, yeah, we won't be discussing the upcoming conclave following the death of Pope Francis. We feel that is getting enough coverage already. I also feel like before we start, I should mention again, as long-time listeners already know, Good Week is not an endorsement and vice versa. We're not necessarily being shady in who we hand out our Bad Week to.
Are we?
Well, not always. And a final housekeeping notice before I get started. My Bad Week this week is the part of the show that is brought to you in collaboration with leading radio stations across Europe as part of a partnership with Euronet Plus.
So who are you actually going to give your Bad Week to this week, Dominic?
I've decided to give my Bad Week to Hungary. Last week, the Hungarian parliament passed a constitutional amendment backed by the Prime Minister Viktor Orban, codifying a law that the government passed in March, banning events held by the LGBTQ plus community, including, most notably, Pride. So yeah, you may have heard about this Pride ban that was passed in mid-March in Hungary. It did make quite some headlines. This constitutional amendment creates a constitutional backing to that Pride ban law. And that was a law that gives the state permission to use facial recognition software to identify people who organize or attend events such as Pride. Those people can be fined up to 200,000 Hungarian forints, which is about 500 euros.
Wow. But just so I understand this thing properly, was it actually necessary for this constitutional amendment to pass in order for the bill to be fully functional?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I must admit, I'm no specialist in Hungarian law, but I heard a political scientist in Budapest talking to DW News, Melana Barley, and she was talking about exactly this issue. She said, actually, that the constitutional amendment was pretty much symbolic and that it has no practical or legal necessity.
Okay.
But yeah, even if it is mainly symbolic, I'm sure that symbolism will be being felt by LGBTQ plus people in Hungary this week.
Absolutely. What is actually in this constitutional amendment? What does it actually say?
Yeah, well, I should mention that there are a bunch of things in this constitutional amendment related to a range of topics. So it's not just about this Pride bill, but the bit that is supposedly related to Pride is the assertion that a child's right to moral, physical, and spiritual development takes precedence over all other rights, apart from the right to life, but including the freedom of assembly. And Pride is apparently relevant here because Orban's government are trying to claim that a child's moral, physical, or spiritual development is endangered by a Pride march. I feel like we could insert crickets here, like they do on reality TV programs.
Oh, that's grim, though. And not the first time you've heard that kind of thing from Orban's government, obviously.
No, it's not. The constitutional amendment also takes on some other political targets of the Hungarian government as well. It enshrines into law that the state only recognizes two sexes, male and female, effectively denying the recognition or existence of some transgender, non-binary and intersex people. And the constitutional amendment also makes it possible for Hungary to strip a dual national of their Hungarian citizenship if they are deemed to present a threat to the security or sovereignty of Hungary. Now, this amendment is being seen by many analysts as an intimidation tactic to opposition, and it is expected to be used against people such as independent journalists and people working for NGOs. That's actually been confirmed by some members of the ruling Fidesz party. So it could have a pretty chilling effect. And yeah, therefore I am giving Bad Week to Hungary. And it's a bad week for diversity, a bad week for the freedom of assembly, a bad week for equality, and yeah, a bad week for human rights in Hungary.
And I don't want to drop you in it or anything, but originally, listeners, Dominic wanted to give Hungary Good Week this week, but then you texted me saying, I don't think I can make this a Good Week story. This is very clearly a Bad Week story. And I very kindly obliged. But just out of curiosity, how were you planning on sending this to me as a good week?
Yes, okay. Well, at first, I really wanted to look at this optimistically and give Good Week to Hungarian civil society or the Hungarian LGBTQ plus community for showing courage in the face of oppressive legislation. But yeah, even if that is also true, I think it would have been a bit hard to swallow. I think it might have been a little bit toxically positive. But that said, There are a few things I want to mention that might give people like a little bit of hope. I was really impressed by this march that was organized by this satirical political party in Hungary called The Dog with Two Tails. They organized a protest in Budapest in the run-up to the constitutional amendment vote, and I thought the concept was brilliant. It was a march for grey pride, not gay pride, but grey pride, as in the colour.
Oh.
And thousands of people took to the street in their most drab grey clothes, waving monochromatic rainbows. And the marchers were like ironically calling for sameness to be celebrated. Let's all be grey and not differ from each other at all. And I thought it was just a really clever and humorous way to illustrate that what Orban and Fidesz are pushing for is the eradication of colour, the eradication of diversity, trying to make everyone the same. So yeah, it was an example of an action that made me think I could maybe spin this as Good Week. But yeah, another reason I was seriously considering framing this as Good Week was because of some hints of maybe, possibly, there might be action coming from the European Union to help protect the fundamental rights of LGBTIQ people in Hungary. There was actually a cross-party delegation of 5 members of the European Parliament that went to Hungary last week on a rule of law mission to discuss an array of concerns in Hungary around the central values of the EU and democratic backsliding. So they weren't just there to discuss and investigate the Pride ban, but that was obviously high on the agenda, seeing as this is something that is happening now. And actually, quick sidebar, in a sign of quite how bad relations have gotten between the EU institutions and Hungary under the rule of Putin-friendly Viktor Orban, Politico had a scoop this week that apparently the members of this delegation were given anti-spying phone pouches to protect their devices from spyware and espionage whilst in Hungary.
Wow. That is quite telling, isn't it?
It really is. And I mean, it's not the first time that there have been reports of the Hungarian government using spyware against civil society or opposition figures. But I found it quite striking that it's now apparently being taken seriously enough that the EU actually provided the MEPs with these metal-lined pouches. Anyway, the delegation were there for a few days and they concluded their trip with a call for the European Commission, the executive body of the European Union, to intervene. They want this latest and anti-LGBTIQ legislation to be added to the ongoing infringement case against Hungary that is awaiting a judgment in the European Court of Justice right now.
Okay, interesting. Do we know otherwise how the European Commission itself is planning on responding to this anti-Pride legislation?
Well, at the time of recording on Tuesday, the 22nd of April, no, we don't know for sure how the Commission will respond. That's also why I felt it was a bit premature to frame this as Good Week for the fight back against this, frankly, pretty oppressive legislation.
Fair enough.
The European Commission has put out a statement saying they're aware of the constitutional amendment. They say that they need to examine the amendment very carefully from the perspective of European law. And as for actions, they will, quote, not hesitate to act if necessary.
Okay.
So this does suggest that something could be coming. And yeah, as I just mentioned, the EU and Hungary are already in the middle of a legal tussle. Well, actually, they're already in the middle of a few legal tussles. But there is this one long-running legal tussle specifically related to Hungary's treatment of the LGBTQ plus community that I referred to earlier, because the MEPs would like to see the case expanded to include the Pride ban. And the Commission began those infringement proceedings against Hungary back in 2021 after Hungary passed this so-called anti-LGBTQ plus propaganda law that year, which the EU say is potentially in breach of the fundamental rights of the European Union and fundamental EU values. Those legal proceedings against Hungary are backed actually by 16 EU member states. So that's 16 other European Union countries that are taking Hungary to court. And they're currently awaiting a ruling in the Court of Justice, which is expected in June this year. So quite soon.
And that law from back in 2021, that was also supposedly about protecting children, right?
Yeah. Viktor Orban and his political party always frame these anti-LGBT laws as necessary in order to protect children. That anti-propaganda law from 2021 that triggered the European Commission's proceedings curtailed depictions or discussions of LGBT issues in media or education that could be seen by children. It famously led to books like that hit young adult graphic novel that's been turned into a Netflix series, Heartstopper, having to be wrapped in bookshops so that children couldn't open them in the shop and be damaged. Such a damaging book, Heartstopper. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
Their eyes!
Yeah.
Protect their eyes!
Anyway, it's all Orban doing his populist war on woke thing. And that was seen again this week because after the constitutional amendment vote passed, he said, in Hungary, common sense matters.
Okay. Why do you think he's focusing his attacks on the LGBTQI community? Like, is banning Pride really the most important thing for him to be doing right now?
Well, no. I think it's very easy to make an argument that no, it's not the most important thing for him to be focusing his attention on. There are huge problems that need fixing in Hungary. There's very high inflation. Hungary has actually some of the highest inflation in the EU right now. And there's a crumbling healthcare system. And of course, a war in bordering Ukraine. Many Hungarians that I've read or heard talking about this think he has moved his attack on Pride up the agenda simply because he has an election coming up next year and he's currently struggling in the polls, which is a pretty new sensation for Orbán and his Fidesz party. It's the most vulnerable he's looked in the polls since he began this stint as prime minister back in 2010. And that's largely because of the meteoric rise of a Fidesz dissenter, his former ally, Peter Magyar, who I think we've discussed on the show before, right?
Yeah, a couple of times, I think.
And he only launched his party, TISA, in 2024, but he already achieved a pretty strong second place result in the European elections last year. And he is now leading in most polls today. So Orbán's rule is under threat. And it seems like he wants to use this anti-pride legislation as a way of reminding people that he is this so-called common sense politician here to protect your Hungarian children. And I guess he wants to forget that his party had a huge political crisis last year when his justice minister had to resign for pardoning a man involved in a cover-up of a child sex abuse case.
Yeah.
So, I think it's a distraction tactic. And I should probably mention that, yes, the disgraced justice minister in question who had to resign just so happens to be the ex-wife of this Peter Magyar, Orbán's current political opponent.
Indeed.
It's complicated. But anyway, I see this Pride ban as just another example of a strongman politician picking on a minority group to try and create a common enemy for his voters who they can blame for problems in society. And in this case, it's queer people, but it's also often migrants who come under political attack from politicians like Orbán.
But this up-and-coming political rival of Orbán's, Peter Magyar, what has he said about this push for anti-pride legislation?
Yeah, that's an important point because some are seeing this legislation as a trap that Orbán is setting for Magyar. Magyar has to keep a pretty broad coalition of supporters together if he's going to have any chance at governing Hungary next year. And if he comes out in vocal support of Orbán's anti-LGBTQ plus laws, he'd of course lose a ton of the more progressive-minded people who are hoping for an end to the Orbán era. But on the other hand, if he defends LGBTQ plus rights loudly, there is the suggestion that he might lose some of his more conservative supporters who are fed up with Orbán but are still pretty socially conservative. There's actually a great piece in Balkan Insight that I'll share a link to examining this law and Magyar's strategy to generally avoid weighing into anything that has to do with anything vaguely identity politicsy. But yeah, Magyar has been quieter than many progressive people in Hungary would like on this issue. But he did say after the Pride ban was first passed in March that Orbán was doing it just to distract from the cost of living crisis in Hungary and that if he is elected, he will protect the right of assembly.
Okay, so it's still a little bit up in the air what's going to happen. And certainly when it comes to Europe's response, we're waiting to hear how the European Commission is going to respond.
Yeah.
What about the people who organise the Pride Parade in Budapest every year? Are they cancelling it? Are they planning to go ahead despite the ban? What's going on?
Yeah, it seems like they want to go ahead despite the new law and this constitutional amendment. Pride in Budapest is scheduled for June the 28th, so that's just over 2 months away. So who knows what will happen in the intervening period. Maybe the EU will be able to get some interim measures in place to protect the march and the right of assembly. Or, yeah, maybe the marchers are going to risk it and go out and celebrate Pride even despite the law. But yeah, I have to say, as a gay man myself, I've always lived in countries where, at least up until recently, I had the privilege to enjoy Pride marches mainly as a celebration, as much as a fight for our rights. And this development in Hungary is just another wake-up call to me. I think Pride is going to feel very different for a lot of people this summer in a lot of places around the world. I mean, just this week in the UK, there was also this Supreme Court ruling that has devastated the trans community there. And I'm not even going to start with what's going on in the USA. But yeah, Pride looks like it's going to be very much needed.
It should be such a joyful event, you know. It's about people saying they're proud of who they are, and being able to celebrate that is a beautiful thing. But as you say, I think those gatherings this year are going to be tinged with a bit more anger and, a real sense of fight back.